Hi, my name's Stephen England from The Art of Sustainability, and in 2019 I had the great privilege of interviewing Herbert Girardet from the Club of Rome, a key contributor to the 2018 report Come On from the Club of Rome. And the theme of the interview was the shadow of Enlightenment, the Enlightenment being a key theme within the report. And my third question to Herbie was, who controls the development of technology?
Okay, so I think we'll move on from whether it's a technological fix onto who runs, who controls technology, who's got the levers of technology, and I think for me it's this one of the questions that is it the consumer or is it the person who is producing the product and the services at the end of the day who has control? So yeah, if we could just open that up a little bit.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think all technologies are the result of a significant investment of some sort or another. Inventiveness, of course, but then investment. For instance, the steam engine was developed by Stephenson, but then had to be invested in by people who had the money to do so. So once that was the case and the money, the technology was there, then of course it could be exploited for profit. So wherever you look, there's always the combination of inventiveness, technological breakthroughs, and then investment with the eye on making profits from that investment. So people don't tend to invest in a new technology unless they reckon there's going to be a significant return on that investment in due course. So you can see that in all technologies that have developed over time. But when it comes to renewable energy technology in particular, it's a very interesting story because, as we already said, the ideas of developing wind and solar came out of the 1970s. In fact, with solar, it was part of the space program. And that, of course, was a breakthrough that wasn't necessarily linked to getting return from that, but then from that technology. But then once it was transferred to domestic use, i.e. for solar roofs and houses, initially it was completely unaffordable. So then feed-in tariffs for renewable energy were introduced around the turn of the century in Denmark and in Germany. And that was basically a policy by governments to say, okay, allow people to be able to invest in this particular technology in a cost-effective way. If they put a solar roof on their house, they get a bit of a return on that investment. So initially, for instance, the feed-in tariffs for solar were about 40 times the conventional power station prices that people would pay for the electricity. That then led to a massive ramping up of the uptake of that technology in Germany, in Denmark, before that also in California. And that then led to a dramatic reduction in the price that people have to pay to buy a solar panel or a wind turbine. So cut long story short, government policy can dramatically drive the move towards uptake of renewable energy. And that has certainly happened historically in a remarkable way. Today, wind and solar is effectively on par in terms of the cost you pay for the electricity produced from this technology as compared with coal or gas-fired power station electricity. So we need government policies in order to stimulate new technologies, and benign, if you like, regenerative, sustainable technology of the future. That also applies, of course, to, for instance, food systems. At the present time, it is cheaper for people to produce food with artificial fertilizers and so on, completely ignoring the need to recycle nutrients from cities, for instance, to return those to farmland because it's simply cheaper to do so. So we need incentives from government to persuade companies to move in that direction, to move towards investing in renewable and sustainable and regenerative farming systems. And similarly, all the other spectrum of technologies that we use on a day-to-day basis. So unless we have a situation where a technology is already cost-effective, for instance, now with solar and wind, having gone through the process of having been stimulated by feed-in tariffs, now suddenly we hear the governor of the Bank of England saying, investing in renewables is becoming cost-effective. In fact, you're going to make a lot of money from this. So the initial stimulus of policy was necessary in order to reach this point. So everywhere you look, we need government policy in order to drive a move towards a green economy.
So moving on from where you were effectively saying about government stimulus. So
Yeah.
the role of government stimulus
Yeah.
in bringing about the changes we need.
Yeah. Yeah, and that of course depends on the ideology of government. So certainly it depends, these policies depend on what type of ideology your government is. My work with the World Future Council, we came up with a whole series of proposals for policies to change the world, and we basically looked at where a particular policy was introduced in a country and how that can be spread to other countries. But then you're up against the problem of ideology. So wherever you have a green government or a green tinge government in place, by definition, you're likely to get progressive technologies that in turn have a beneficial effect on the environment. But in many countries that is not the case. So it's really critically important also to have voting systems, for instance, that it speed up the introduction of green policies through green governments, through the growth of green parties in particular countries.
And so interesting thing for me there, picking up on the theme of the shadow and enlightenment, essentially the shadow of the move towards renewables leaves a lot of people out.
Yeah.
Of that, and part of what you're seeing reactions to is that people like the Rust Belts, where the technologies are being, those skill sets are no longer applicable to renewables. So policy isn't just about investing in new technologies and large investors going to that. There's a social dimension to this in terms of those people who are left behind.
Yeah.
And so this creates this shadow, and the result is people respond to somebody who will say, look, I will speak for you, yeah. So how can policy not just invest in new emerging technologies, but also bridge old technologies and old skill sets that need to come across?
Well, I mean, that relates directly to the sort of history of the Industrial Revolution. When you look at Britain, for instance, there are quite a number of cities whose economy was based on coal and steel. I mean, particularly in North, but also in Wales, take Port Talbot or Swansea, the economies of those cities are based on highly polluting technologies. Then suddenly coal gets phased out and people are left behind and there's no jobs and all the rest of it. So that same story is, of course, you can find in many other countries, particularly also in the United States. I mean, Chattanooga or other cities that were coal and steel based suddenly became redundant as places. So the job of governments, of course, first of all, is to try and find new economies for those regions, for those cities. But certainly sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. For instance, in Britain, we've had zero investment in renewable energy technology. If that had been the case, steelworks in, say, somewhere like Scunthorpe by now should be making towers for wind turbines. But where do those towers come from? They come from Germany, they come from Holland, they come from other countries, from Denmark. They're not produced in this country. So we need to replace, the economies of cities that have lost their raison d'etre by deliberate policies of governments. But it's not always the case that you can replace the technologies that have gone with something that can fully take its place, particularly also because of automation and other developments of that kind. But for instance, take here South Wales. In Merthyr Tydfil and Ebervale, there used to be some of the largest steelworks in Europe. They're gone. But it's an area that has enormous wind power potential, which is not being realized. You could create a whole new energy economy in these very windy valleys in South Wales and replace the economy that is gone with something quite new and quite different based on renewable energy. So that is enlightened government, or in this case it should be the government of South Wales, of Wales, the Parliament in Wales should be taking those types of decisions. But it's not always done, and I mean, it is often governments and politicians are often very short-sighted, and they have, you know, they want to be re-elected in the next election 4 years or 5 years from now, and so they are primarily concerned with short-term issues. So the issue about long-term thinking to be expected from politicians who are caught up in short-term re-election processes is a very problematic one.
And here in Wales, we have the Wellbeing Future Generations legislation, and that creates opens opportunities for new thinking, investment. So I think the question is, can we carry on with mass consumption if our economy is efficiently recycling? Is that something? Can we carry on with our lifestyles as they are?
Not really.
And
no.
just be more efficient in our use of resources, or does that all have to go as well?
No, I think the whole concept of standard of living needs to be rethought. Obviously, which is a very tricky issue because a lot of people who feel today we have a standard of living that is so much better than in the past. Therefore, we want more of this rather than less of this. But at the same time, some economists are saying, how about a happiness economy? How about coming to a way of life where we have much greater community existence, you know, where people and neighbors and families are going to fulfilling not just needs of consumption, but also emotional needs. So moving in that direction is now of critical importance. But we certainly haven't seen any concrete development in that direction. We are still seeing everybody, whether it's companies or governments, talking about we need more economic growth because we have to replace lost jobs that come are lost out of automation, and companies that borrow money in order to invest need to get that money back. For that reason, they need economic growth. So we need to break through fundamentally through that, if you like, vicious cycle of depending on economic growth as a key aspect of our current way of life. And unless we find a really dramatic new way in which to think about economics, that's not going to happen.
So going back to the question of the idea of who controls the development technology, is it the investor or is it the consumer?
Well, today it's primarily the investor wanting to have a return on their investment. But the good news is that certainly some of the forward-looking renewable and regenerative technologies are beginning to become not just cost-effective, but promising significant returns on investment. And this is certainly where when you listen to the Governor of the Bank of England in recent speeches, he said, here is a whole new sector of the economy that should go mainstream. And that, you know, then matches both the need for a good return on investment while simultaneously matching the need for a different way of relating to nature in our daily ways of life.
So is it that we, the consumers, will change our behaviour because the investors are changing their behaviour? Or is it...
Up to a point, yes. I mean, certainly the question still is whether or not, just because we have a dramatic increase in the input of in the availability of renewable energy, that whether that contributes to an overall change in our lifestyles, and that's certainly not certain by any means at this stage.